So the timeless leadership principles, as the name implies, what I think these principles are about are principles that have been around for hundreds, thousands of years in a lot of ways, and yet we've modernized and updated some of them with things like emotional intelligence research and some of the other kinds of work that we've touched on and research that we'll be touching on. So the distinction then, of course, today and tomorrow morning is about teams and organizations. Tomorrow afternoon is about career, family, personal application. So right now, this assessment is going to be around the organizational or the team application of these principles. So looking at, first of all, my thinking in putting this together, one thing I wanted to emphasize is that for me, this is the core. The focus and context, what we're paying attention to, what we're focusing on, and then the context has to do with the culture, the environment that comes out of all of that. And there are three key questions, which I'll get to momentarily, that make up that core. And then around the outside are these other principles that I think flow out of that core, and they're circular. There's real no beginning or end. They're all very much interconnected, hence the idea of being a wheel with the hub, focus and context, and these principles around the outside. So that's our leadership wheel, or if I am in a dad joke mood, I'll call that our wheelie good leadership model. But I promised Chris I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't lay a bunch of dad jokes on you. Vanessa bought me a Christmas card a few years back, and it said, "Dad, this Christmas I'm going to do something really special for you." And you open it up and it said, "I'm going to laugh at one of your jokes." I don't know if I ever collected on that. I have to think back on that one. So there's probably a few other dad jokers in the room here, maybe even some mom jokers in here. So let's start first of all then with a quick look at focus and context. And focus and context, as I mentioned, has really three key questions to it. And in no particular order, let me go through the questions. I'll identify where they are in your workbook so that you don't have to be furiously trying to scribble these down. Or sorry, in your book, the Leader's Digest book. Which, by the way, at any time throughout these couple of days, if you'd like me to sign your books for you, I'd be happy to do that. Although someone said they wouldn't get as much for it on eBay if I put their name in it. That really restricts the market. So that's up to you. Page 30 of the Leader's Digest are the three questions that entire chapter is then structured around. And in no particular order then are these questions. First of all, where are we going? So at the hub of our leadership wheel, at the center of strong leadership, is this principle that's been around for a long, long time, that strong leaders have, we can call it different things, have a vision about where they're going, they have real foresight or strategic thinking or looking forward, and they're painting for themselves and their team their preferred future. Because in times of change, particularly, as we talked about some of this morning, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of concern, there's catastrophizing, that's a word I just made up, yeah, I have to think about that, Frank. But there's this tendency to project a bit of a negative image of the future. And of course, what we're learning more and more when you look at the world, this quirky, weird world of quantum physics, which I'll touch on a little bit more tomorrow, or when you look at, well, most recently, one of the videos and books that's become very popular is The Secret, which is all about the law of attraction, which I first bumped into in the mid-'70s in a couple of other books that go back to about the 30s or 40s. And that was very powerful for me, this whole notion that we set up around ourselves a kind of magnetic force, and that we attract people, circumstances, and events, and repel people, circumstances, and events in accordance with what we're setting up for ourselves. Which then, since that time, research like Richard Wiseman's in the UK, his research on luck, has shown that there are ways that we set up our own luck. And the lucky circumstances and breaks in our lives, or unlucky circumstances or breaks. Again, we'll build on a bit more of this tomorrow. So that's more from the personal side. The organizational side, the same thing is true. Would you agree that there are organizations that have cultures of success, cultures of performance, cultures of attracting the best and the brightest and real magnet organizations that are bringing in good, strong people that reinforce that organization. And there's the opposite. There are cultures of mediocrity. There are even cultures of failure, where the thinking patterns, the expectations, the mood, the environment is a very negative one. So one of the key things that strong leaders do is they bring about or help to enable or strengthen or reinforce that picture of the preferred future where they're trying to take the organization. And then intertwined with that are core values or beliefs. How many in your organization have done some of this kind of work? You've identified what your core values are? Lots of organizations are doing that these days. As I said earlier, most of our work around values these days is not clarifying them or identifying them. It's how do we revitalize them, how do we maybe even revise them in some ways, and how do we bring them alive in the organization. And so what you'll find in that section of the book is some discussion around that point. And essentially these points, as you think about values and how you exemplify and bring values alive in your own organization and with your own leadership, values really live in the key people decisions. So whether values in your organization have a high snicker factor or have a real resonance, really resonate with people and really energize people depends tremendously on your leadership of your team and the leadership of others in the organization. So is this, we just did our values thing and we got a pretty parchment paper hanging up in the lobby somewhere, or is this thing really alive? Does it really have meaning? So where it has meaning, it's used very much front and center in hiring, in the whole hiring process. A little later on we're going to look at a video which is taken from Southwest Airlines, and of course their culture is built very strongly around people and the whole human side, and hiring and getting the right fit is a very key element of their culture. And anytime you look at studies of high-performing organizations, you see that they tend to put an enormously heavier focus on the hiring process than most other organizations do. They'll have multiple interviews, 3, 4, 5. They'll have all kinds of assessment instruments, and well, the Toyota folks, you guys have really worked hard. You do simulations, and I know you do a tremendous amount of work making sure you're getting the right people with the right fit. And one of the I don't think you exactly use this adage as Southwest does, but I would guess it's probably similar, is that you hire for attitude and train for skill. Right? Would you say that's probably a lot of what Toyota does? And you'll see that showing up in the video later, is we hire for attitude and train for skill. Now, clearly, Air Canada is not going to be hiring people that aren't qualified pilots to fly the planes. And so clearly you need sets of skills that match what the job is to be done. But when you've got a given group of fairly similar people, you start to look at, okay, how do we then get the people who most fit our culture, who will reinforce our culture, who will perpetuate our culture, who will strengthen our culture. And so when you go back to the little triangle model, technology, well, that you're in the game or not based on your technical skills, so are you a qualified pilot or not? And then obviously some of the managerial things are important, whether it's time management, personal management, and habits and so on. But then we start to get down to the squishier, softer stuff of attitude and of mindset and of openness to learning and change and adaptability and a lot of those kinds of things that are much, much harder to get a handle on and take a lot more work to assess. And most organizations aren't willing to put that kind of work in. Many organizations really take the approach of, well, we need a couple of warm bodies in here, let's just get some people. And as long as they're technically qualified and have all that other stuff, let's get them in here and get to work and spend very little time around the values fit. So that's a key element. This is another key element. In fact, there's a fairly growing body of research now around the field of cultural leadership that says the single most significant perpetuator of a culture or determinant of a culture in an organization is who gets promoted for what behavior. So you can do all the other things that you want to around trying to perpetuate a culture, change a culture, but what are people getting promoted for? Because those become the role models for the organization. They perpetuate the organization's culture. And of course, there are very clear signals being sent. And in too many organizations, you get these pretty parchment words on paper and all these wonderful things about how we treat customers and each other and teamwork and innovation and all kinds of things. And then you promote the meanest SOB in the place that, by God, gets the job done, leaves a bunch of dead bodies in his or her wake, but they get results. Well, that's really what the values of the organization are. Never mind all those pretty words. That's what the organization truly values. Is that, or again, back to the triangle. You say, well, we really want teamwork, we want participation, we want involvement, we want leadership, but we keep promoting people with lots of technical skills who really have none of that other stuff, or haven't even spent a lot of time developing a lot of that other stuff. But we keep saying, yeah, but that's what we really want. Those are our values. Well, no, they're not. Your values are technical ability. Your values aren't those other things, because that's what the kinds of people you're promoting, that's the kinds of people that you're screening and hiring for. Those are your values. And then, of course, what gets recognized? Tomorrow we'll talk more about recognition, but what gets formally and informally recognized, what gets noticed, what gets reinforced, very much then determines are these values true or real or not, are we really living in alignment with them? And then, of course, lastly is what behaviors we're prepared to put up with. So we're prepared to put up with the individual who's a really good individual performer, but is a disaster as a team player and actually destroys teams. But boy, they are just so valuable as technical specialists or as individuals. We're willing to put up with their horrible team behavior in order to get some of the rest of that. Well, then maybe the value isn't really teamwork and team playing, because you're not really dealing with it. You're not trying to hold them accountable. You're not trying to, in some way, or whether it's customer focus or whatever it may be, whatever the values are, if people are violating those and we aren't dealing with them, we're allowing it to continue, we're essentially saying that's the standard. We're letting it drop. A restaurant CEO years ago that I worked with, he was head of a restaurant chain across Canada, he said, when I walk into a restaurant, a local restaurant, and if I walk through the parking lot and there's garbage in the parking lot and I don't say something or do something about it and just walk into the restaurant and let it go, I've just set the standard. I've just said it's okay to have garbage in the parking lot. So how do we deal with the exceptions with people that are not living the values? And this one will also get us into the discussion later this afternoon about moose on the table and taking trips to Abilene, where we allow some of these things to continue on without doing anything about them and allow ourselves to be victims. So that's a quick look at the, oh sorry, I didn't get to the third question. The third question then of the three at the center is, why do we exist? What's our purpose? What's our reason for being? What are we here to do? And this one is probably in lots of ways the most difficult. Lots of organizations write mission statements to try to get at this. But a lot of mission statements sound like they've been written by committees of lawyers. And probably some of you have been involved in some of those vernacular engineering debates where do you put the comma here, the comma there? Do you use this word or that word? And in the end, once you're just also exhausted by that exercise, you say, okay, we got the mission statement, and then you go on with back to the real world again and back to work. And the mission statement really has no meaning. And so this is probably one of the more challenging leadership tasks, is how do we keep connected to the heart of our organization or to why we exist? Do a bit of self-assessment. How much of your time are you currently spending in technical areas, technical problem solving, maybe teaching technical, well, no, teaching wouldn't be so much. It's the technical problem solving. There's time that you're spending right now dealing with technical issues, solving technical problems, and making decisions based on your technical expertise. So how much time do you spend doing that now? Or think of your meetings. How much of our time in our meetings do we spend there? How much time are we spending, or do you spend in the management side? And again, you can go back to the other page if you want to refresh what that is. But that's the systems and processes and analysis and data and goals and measures. So it's all that head stuff, so all the thinking and planning and so on. So how much time do you spend there in what's traditionally thought of as a management role? And then how much do you spend in that softer area that emotional intelligence gets at, which is just exploring your own self a little more, understanding your own self, looking at your strengths and weaknesses, and then, of course, the dealing with others, coaching and developing, and looking at the team and its dynamics and effectiveness, the team that you're leading, and doing what's that longer-term developmental kind of work. So there is no formula here. I'm not going to give you a magic solution that says it ought to be this or this or this. It varies a lot according to situations and where you're at, and what your responsibilities are, the changes that are going on in your organization, all things that are going to vary this. But where do you think you are now? Are you a third, and a third? Are you half, 25, 25 on any of these? Are you 80% on one and 10 and 10 on the others? And then where do you think you ought to be? And unless you're in perfect balance right now, and very few of us are in absolute perfect balance, there's always some gap there that we're trying to deal with. What do you think it ought to be? And the principle is really built around the basic premise that leadership is an action, not a position. And that's a theme you'll see in a lot of my work. You'll certainly see it in the two books, is that if it is to be, it's up to me. So the whole notion that leaders make things happen, leaders are navigators, leaders move things forward and don't just sit around waiting for somebody else to do something. And so within that, we end up with a couple of different approaches. One is, for example, on page 20 of your workbook, there's a little scale there, a little continuum around degrees of control. And what this is trying to remind us of is that in any of our workplaces and any of our organizations, we operate on this continuum where there are some things that we have fairly direct control over. There's this large area, often gray and debatable area, as to what we can influence, how much we can influence, what our degree of influence is, and then we have this area of absolute no control at all. So let's just go over here for a moment. What are examples of things that you have control over? What do you directly control, or 80% control? So yourself, your own attitude, your own response, so that, sure, that's very much part of it. How about then within your team and your organization? What are things that you can control? It's going to vary around the room. Some of you have more autonomy, less autonomy, more control, less control. But what are some of the things you actually know? A couple of leaders who did an exercise where they asked in teams and town hall meetings, what's the dumbest thing we do? That was all they put on the flip chart. Yeah, no, you have to name the whole list. So what are all the dumbest things, I guess, yeah, dumbest things we do? And just start listing them. And when you seriously get into an exercise like this, you end up with dozens, flip charts full of things that are driving people crazy, things that are getting in the way, problems, barriers, obstacles. So you go back, you do that, and then you cluster together. And of course, the basic clustering or affinity kind of process is to say, well, this is automatically A. Is that the same as A? No, that's B. Is that, well, that's different, that's C. No, that's kind of like B. No, that's D. Well, that's A, and all the way through. And when you do that, you usually end up with 6 to 8 clusters. It's a common sort of range. And then we can come back and do some of this kind of work. Come back and say, okay, with these major clusters, which ones do we directly control? So there's usually a lot of debate back and forth, but we end up maybe agreeing, well, we have mostly a pretty good control over that, and maybe there's one other one. Which one do we have influence over? So we might identify a couple of those, and from medium to high influence, and then which ones do we have no control over at all? So, now that we're dealing with change, and we're talking about introducing change, and we've got all these changes, or it could be, the exercise could be, what are the biggest changes, or whatever it is. Now, what do we do? What's the obvious next step once we've gone this far? Start to put together some action plans, start to figure out, okay, well, let's focus on the things we can control. Maybe we want to increase our influence in a couple of areas, so we're going to have to strategize and figure out how to get more influence. and we get to work on it. Well, that's an example of servant leadership, of a leader saying, how can we or how can I work to remove obstacles, barriers, work to release more energy, more focus, etc. in the organization.
Jim, I had read your book on this, and I did this with my team a while back.
Mm-hmm.
And the other neat thing that came out of it was stuff they thought they had no control over. By the end of the exercise, they realized they did have some control and a great deal of influence. And
excellent.
Leads into an action plan where they felt powerless over things.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because that is another one of the purposes of the exercise, is that it seems to be over time we drift down below the line and we disempower ourselves. If we spend more time in this principle, we'll come back to, there's a little assessment exercise on how we disempower ourselves and give up control or believe we have no control. And so this kind of thing brings us back around to say, hey, you know, we have more control over this than we really realize. Any other thoughts, comments? Okay, well, let's back to page 15. How do you think you're doing on this one? On keeping above the line, navigating above the line, influencing, degrees of control, servant leadership, all of these things. Okay, so moving in, I'm going to move into authenticity. And here's where we're going to talk about how to fake leadership. Well, that's a joke. Don't write that down. Fake leadership. This is, well, Groucho Marx years ago said, I've got values, and I'm going to stand tough to those values, and if you don't like those values, I've got others. So we all recognize real quick, and we use words all the time, like walk the talk, lead by example. We all recognize that we need to be consistent and authentic. The main area that I've tended to focus on around authenticity these days, tomorrow we're going to talk a bit more about that element of authenticity, which is, are we being consistent? This afternoon, I want to really look a little more at courageous conversations, which I mentioned earlier, and some of the concepts around moose on the table. So are we having open and authentic conversations in our organizations? So the moose on the table, there's a little graphic of the moose standing in the middle of the table. And it's eating off of one end of the table. It's dropping moose pies off of the other end of the table. People are looking around its legs. It's slowing things down. It's even having babies. Maybe other moose are coming in. And as we said earlier, the moose represents what? What's the metaphor about? The moose is issues people don't want to talk about. Why? Why don't we talk about these issues?
Don't want to hurt feelings.
Fear, don't want to hurt feelings. They're controversial.
What to do about it?
A feeling of almost a victim kind of feeling. There's nothing we can do about it anyway.
What was that?
So just repeat that. Career-ending discussion, yeah. This could be a CLM, a career-limiting moose. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Why we don't address them? So it's all of those kinds of things. And again, we'll come back, because this typically is a principle we come back to, we'll come back to later on and talk a bit more about how do we have more of those kinds of discussions, and what is it that causes some of these moose, and how can we get more of these issues out on the table. So a quick example of, if you go to page 22, you'll see some of the signs of moose on the table. And maybe you've been part of the conversation where after the meeting, the real conversation happened in the hallway outside. I didn't want to say anything at the meeting, but he's really full of it. There is no way. And then the real conversation, the authentic conversation occurs. or people agree, or commitments are kept, and then everybody goes off and does their own thing. And all right, on to passion and commitment. We were doing some work in one organization. We work with a group of colleagues in the Clemmer group who do some ongoing work with a couple of clients, and often we start with some assessment, survey work, focus groups, that kind of thing. So we're getting ready to do some of this work, and talking to the general manager of this division, I asked him, well, how many people work here? And he said, oh, about half. And then as we started to do that assessment work, we could see that he might even have been a little bit on the optimistic side, because that was an organization that really struggled with this principle. They really had some disengaged people. Here are the overall studies, or here's one example, and we have one other client we're working with right now has found similar thing inside their own organization. This is Canadian data. Whoops, it's not the right slide. It's and I suspect that in the U.S. and perhaps in New Zealand there'll be some similar kinds of numbers coming out. It's showing that, this was 2 years ago, this study was done, that 17% of Canadians are engaged, in the way Towers Perrin defined that as willing to invest discretionary effort. Or a term I've used for years is volunteerism. It's that voluntary extra effort to go above and beyond, to do more, to invest extra energy. So it's not just meeting the minimum job requirements, it's doing more and going beyond that. So that's how they're defining engagement. So willing to invest more of that discretionary effort. So they're saying that as a general trend, there's been a drop in that area in the last couple of years. The middle part of the bell curve then shows about 2/3 of Canadians across the workforces are moderately engaged. So some days they're fairly engaged and will give extra effort. Other days, I'm out of here. I've got a plane to catch, train to catch, I'm just out of here. It's not my job, not my department, don't put it on me, I'm just going to go get out of here and let somebody else worry about and deal with it. So kind of up and down, depends on the day, depends on the situation, depends on what's going on in the team, depends on whether they're above the line or below the line that particular day. So it can go back and forth. So there's the huge engagement opportunity. We've got this large group of people that are only moderately engaged. So there's a real leadership opportunity there. Then at the other end of the bell curve, we have 17% in this study that are disengaged. Actively disengaged, actively disconnected. They're the people that I mentioned earlier that have quit but still keep coming into work every day. But they've pretty much stopped any kind of commitment to the organization, the team. They're just, what's the minimum I need to do to get my job done? So you look at that, and how many of you in your organizations are concerned about these days retention, attracting and retaining and hanging on to good people? A lot of people are. That's a big issue for many, many people. And so this is where some of this data was done within that discussion as well, saying, okay, well, looking at this, how does that correlate then with some of the retention kinds of studies and issues? And so what they found further was that of those respondents who were highly engaged, the first group, 63% have no plans to leave. So, and that makes sense, of course. They're engaged, they're connected, they're feeling very attached to the organization. Compared at the other end of the extreme with 12%. In other words, if you take the flip side of that, 88% of these people probably either have plans to leave or could easily be swayed to leave if something better came along. Sometimes managers look at that and say, good, well, they should leave. They're disengaged anyway. But they may be some of the best technicians. They may have some of the most experience. They may be pretty valuable people that you want to hang on to, but they've given up or they've disconnected from the organization. So those are the two groups, obviously, where there's lots of opportunity, and there's huge opportunity here. Here you may be dealing with such a cynical and disconnected group that it may be difficult to re-engage them. That could be part of the case. Or sometimes what you have down here are very passionate people who have a lot of energy and passion, but right now it's turned negative. And if you can turn that passion around, they will very quickly flip from here to here. If we can figure out how to get them reconnected, re-engaged.
Do you think that there's the scale of what we determine to be engagement is shifting with the next generation in terms of that extra effort they're talking about there, whereas I think it was
Not according to...
they're talking about this is the work ethic, this is what we expect,
Yeah.
what we live right now versus the next generation coming in, and what their expectations are.
Yeah, that's a popular belief, but there's a fair bit of evidence to say that it's not really, the next generation is not really that different. In fact, let me just show you some of that, because this is a section where there's a lot of research has gone on around these issues. Dave Sirota and his team have been working on issues around workforce engagement and motivation of people and all that sort of thing for quite a few decades. And he hits that directly in some of this work right here. What he basically argues and found is that the three driving forces of engagement in any workplace are the need to be treated fairly, the desire to have a sense of achievement and pride in your work, and the desire to have productive relationships with your coworkers. What he finds is that people want these things, and it's the same for all generations, men, women, black, white, Asians, and all around the world. And they've got a huge database from around the world. What I think, and where I think maybe you're going, is today there's two more factors that get layered on top of this. One is that there isn't an ethic of join a company and stay for life, as there was perhaps when many of us joined our companies. And secondly, there's a lot more choice available to today's workforce. There are many more options than may have been available back when perhaps some of us started into the workplace. And so we can, the people who don't feel that they're getting this can move on much more easily.
Are there a lot more instances or studies gone around on how to, especially that top, how to not just the fairly, treated fairly, but the pride in work and productive relationships with coworkers? How do you do that in today's environment where there's a lot more home-based offices and you're not connecting and have personal interactions in there because we're living on the barrier of email and phone and we're doing that. So that office environment, that plant environment isn't this. And as we move more and more to a intelligence-based economy, we're going to get less and less of that.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
The question, and again, some of the problems I see is how do you keep that engagement when they're so distant?
No question, absolutely. And that's, again, if we get deeper into this principle, we're going to go drill down much further into that issue. So it adds extra complexity or difficulty, but at the root, it's still many of the same issues. And so, for example, just continuing on with this data, that if an organization has one of the three, it has 10% of employees rating themselves as highly satisfied. If the organization has two of the three, then it goes up to 20%. If the organization has all three, you see an increase of up to 45%. So, part of where does that come from then, Frank? Well, just to finish off with this particular data, but it certainly illustrates well this whole issue here, is that there's four kinds of cultures. And the cultures are paternalistic. A lot of those cultures still around. Treating people as children, clear delineation of who's the boss and who's management and who's frontline and where did that idea come from, and we'll take care of you, we'll look after you. Healthcare is full of paternalism, and not only inside the organization, but how they treat patients and families as well. There's a tremendous amount of paternalism all through healthcare, but it's in many, many organizations. Adversarial, especially in highly unionized environments. There's lots of adversarial kinds of relationships set up. And adversarial cultures, we, they, gaps, silos, chimneys, layers, etc. Transactional. This is a little more interesting one. This one's a little more subtle. Sometimes words like head count, FTEs, that is full-time equivalents, or even the word human resources could be argued, or a word that drives me nuts that comes out of the HR field is human assets. There are now books and conferences on managing human assets. Well, that's very much this kind of culture, where people are things. They happen to have skin wrapped around them. They're just another set of assets to be managed. And of course that comes across when you start to be treated as an it. You may be familiar with the philosophy of I, thou, and I, it, where I see someone else as an it versus seeing someone else as a thou, as a respect and seeing the good and the humanity in others versus they're just a cipher. They're just a factor of production. They're an it. They're not a person. And so there's a fair bit of that, but it's more subtle in many organizations. And but you hear it showing up in some of that kind of language that I've just identified. Headcount is one that drives me particularly crazy because I grew up on a dairy farm, and how many head are you milking? How many head? But in a lot of ways, that's the way it's treating people as cattle. And then partnerships, and the whole argument shows this research and lots of other research, and some of it is cited in this chapter of the book, shows that the more we partner and treat people in an organization as partners, the stronger is going to be those three elements that we've just talked about. And so part of the way I would come back, Frank, and say, yeah, we have this dispersed workforce, we have this geographic, but how these sorts of things come across, because these kinds of cultures transmit through the BlackBerries, transmit through the conference calls, transmit through, and so if I'm feeling like I'm being treated as one of these first three, and I now have the disconnect of distance, it's just going to accentuate the problem more. But if I feel like I'm truly a number 4, then the use of technology may make it a little harder to get together, but we'll find ways to make it work. We'll figure it out because we treat each other as adults and we treat each other as valued partners, and we'll figure it out. So in the end, it's a deeper set of values or philosophy or culture that we may not even recognize we're a product of the culture of the organization. We may be in an organization as one of these three, and it's harder to do, but I've certainly seen a number of good examples of where you have an island of partnership inside a bigger organization like this. And maybe you've seen examples of that. Maybe you are leading an example of that. I hope you are, where your team, your part of the organization, is a true team-based partnering organization, but you're inside a bigger culture. So you're a good example, if you are then, of a navigator who refuses to be a victim of the bigger culture and figuring out how to navigate, because typically what will happen is people will turn around and say, well, it's the bigger culture. I have a big client that I'm working with right now and doing a series of ongoing supervisory management leadership workshops out over the next couple of years, and this is a major issue for them, and we're having the worst time trying to get supervisors and middle managers to recognize how victimized they are by the big culture and to start to break free of that and stop pointing to the culture is the reason for things being done and start taking more responsibility for their own behavior and starting to act like leaders rather than just going along with the bigger culture. It's hard to do, and it's hard to kind of wake people up to it. So that's a quick look at some of the factors around. I guess I'll just add one other one, since we talked about retention, and many of you said that you're concerned about retention. The Gallup organization has been doing a lot of really good work around retention and employee engagement and many of these kinds of issues. And this is one of, I think they have 4 different books out now that in some way or another deals with some of this. This was their first one. And it was based on in-depth interviews by Gallup of over 80,000 managers in over 400 companies, the largest of its kind. And what this reinforced, in the quote that I'm about to show you, shows that people join the organization but quit their boss. Whether they physically walk out the door or whether they quit and stay, that it's the immediate boss that is the single biggest variable in how committed people are in the organization. So here's what they say, that they leave managers, not companies. So much money has been thrown at keeping good people in the form of pay, perks, training, etc. In the end, turnover is mostly a manager issue. So whether that's, again, as I said, actual turnover, people leaving, or people staying but quitting. So if you have a turnover problem, first look to your managers. So this is a bit of the look in the mirror part to say, well, what that's saying, the number isn't in here exactly, but their findings were roughly 70% of the time the reason a person leaves their job is because of their immediate boss, because of the way they were treated. What's deceptive, however, is when you do the exit interviews, if your organization does exit interviews, and you ask, why'd you quit? How many times do you think they'll say, I quit because of my boss? Why? Why wouldn't you just say that? Well, I quit because of my boss. The guy just was treating me poorly, or I was a cipher, or some of the things we saw earlier, I was treated paternalistically, or he ignored me, or how many times? Why don't we say things like that when we leave?
Don't want to burn your bridges.
Yeah, there's a big one. Don't want to burn our bridges? What else?
People don't recognize it as that. They can't put it into words. They don't feel good.
Right.
There's something about it, but they can't really.
They may not have made the cause and effect relationship there. It's just I don't like my work that much, it's not exciting me, but they don't understand maybe how the manager set the tone of the team and so on. Yeah? Any other thoughts on why we don't say things like that when we leave?
They don't care anymore. They don't have anything invested in it.
Yeah, so what we typically will say then, of course, is, well, there's a better opportunity, or there's these kinds of circumstances. And so we don't hear a lot of that in our own organizations. And so it's easy for many managers to kind of sit back and say, well, this isn't a problem here because nobody's telling me that they're quitting because of me. Nobody's telling me. I'm not hearing this problem in the organization. But 70% of the time, that's the root of most turnover issues, is growing and developing. The analogy that I use here is what I call the fish tank factor. That if you take apparently a little goldfish, keep it in a small bowl, it'll always stay small. Take that same fish, put it into a much larger tank, what happens to it? It gets bigger. Most of them get bigger. Now, of course, the bell curve applies here again, and some may not get much bigger. But most of them will get bigger. Some will get really big. And so we can come back to the management leadership balance that we talked about just before lunch and say, well, management is seeing people as they are. So I'm looking at this situation, and I'm seeing it for what it is and as they are. Leadership is developing people into what they could be. So leadership is seeing that potential, building that bigger environment, and drawing out more of that potential. So this principle really gets deep into the area of coaching, and particularly it's built, again, the management leadership balance. This particular. All right, now moving on to spirit and meaning. Spirit and meaning is really a continuation in many ways of passion and commitment. And it's an outgrowth of the third question in the core, which you may recall was, why do we exist? What are we here for? So how do we extend this sense of commitment and engagement to a deeper purpose, meaning, a deeper reason for being? The metaphor I like here is the one of the honeybee. Apparently in the world of the honeybee, the queen bee doesn't make decisions or run operations. The queen bee's only existence is to exude a chemical substance, which is the spirit or the essence of the hive, and it literally keeps the hive together. I think that's a powerful metaphor to think about leadership. We can't all be queen bees just sitting around exuding chemical substances all day, but we have to be worker bees too. But when you think about the metaphor, what am I doing to build the spirit or the team, the essence of why we're here? And how am I bringing that deeper sense of purpose, extending the commitment and passion to the organization, or reconnecting to why we exist and what the purpose of our organization is? Where he looked at high intelligence and high leadership, and he studied competency models. How many of you have a competency model in your organization? You've identified the key skills, the key skill sets, so a number of you have them. So he looked at almost 200 of them from various organizations and tried to identify then how they were broken down. What he found is that there were three categories. There was purely technical, there were cognitive skills. So you come back to the triangle. This overlays quite nicely with the triangle. And then there was the emotional intelligence areas. And what he found was that emotional intelligence proved to be twice as important as the others at all levels. But then at the managerial and certainly the senior management level, star performers, nearly 90% of the difference in their profiles was attributable to emotional intelligence. That was the huge difference, was their level of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. So the ability to manage that soft side. It sounds like you guys talked a bit about the emotional side of the organization, which is the heart of leadership. That's at the very essence of what strong leadership is all about. But what we tend to do in our organizations, especially very technical organizations, like healthcare, or many of you are in technical industries, technical organizations, we tend to promote people for their technical abilities. And yet, as is found in one of Goleman's other books here, he talks about this paradox of where they studied once successful managers who failed. So this is not a statement of all managers. This is saying managers who were promoted, usually for their technical ability, who failed ultimately. And the reason that they failed was that their technical strength became a liability. Now, how is that possible? How does their technical strength become a liability?
Micromanagement.
That's a big one. Micromanagement, absolutely big one.
I can do better than the other person.
Sure. That may be more technically, and it may be true that that manager is the most technically skilled or knowledgeable person in the group. So there's a tendency then to do that. What else?
They may be so focused on their technical abilities that they don't realize the changes happening around them.
Okay, yeah. So that's my comfort zone. That's my focal point. That's why I was promoted. That's what I need to keep doing. So I'm not looking at that much bigger picture.